We want to continue with the program for the evening. So if I can have your attention, we'll start with the discussion, the conversation with Graham Burnett. Graham was very much hoping to be here in person. He's had some health concerns that have prevented him from traveling here today, but he was insistent on being here virtually on Zoom. So we arranged to set that up, to have him Zoom in. And Clayton Spencer, who's going to be having the conversation with him, is also on Zoom. So I will be the person in the room, the connection to the real in-person audience, and they will be on Zoom. And it looks like they are on Zoom. I'm on Zoom as well. Interesting. So we're all on Zoom together, and we're really excited about having Graham being part of our conference. His book is available. He's unfortunately not available to sign it, but if you'd like a copy of his book, it's there on the table on the back left from where I'm standing on the stage. You can get a copy of that. And we're thrilled to have him here. We're thrilled with his dedication to what the coalition is doing, his enthusiasm for our work, and really his willingness to be here as he navigates his own health considerations. And the conversation with Graham will be conducted by Clayton Spencer. So let me introduce Clayton, and then I will let Clayton talk to Graham, and we'll be off and running. We'll have an opportunity to have some questions, and we'll just continue from there. All right, so Clayton Spencer will be talking to Graham. Clayton served as the 8th president of Bates College. Under President Spencer's leadership, the college tripled its annual giving, more than doubled its endowment, and completed the largest fundraising campaign in the college's history. She was a very successful president. She also spearheaded the creation of Bates' nationally recognized Purposeful Work Program, which we talk about an awful lot. That's a big part of what Bates' involvement is, the big part of what Bates' involvement is with the coalition. And the Purposeful Work Program mobilizes the core strength of the liberal arts to prepare students to navigate the evolving worlds of work. Clayton currently serves on the boards of the Davis Education Foundation, the Portland Museum of Art, and Easterly Funds Trust, and on the steering committee of the Coalition for Transformational Education. She has previously been a member of the boards of Williams College, Phillips Exeter Academy, the American Council on Education, the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, the Annapolis Group, and other higher education organizations. She earned a JD from Yale Law School, where she was an editor of the Yale Law Journal, a BA from Williams College, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa, and master's degrees from Oxford and Harvard universities. So I'm going to hand it over to Clayton and to Graham, and they'll have their conversation and let us listen in, and then you have an opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I was trying to ask if everybody in the audience could hear me, not pointing the fickle finger of fate at myself. Good evening and welcome to our distinguished guest, Graham Burnett. Graham is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History at Princeton University, where he completed his undergraduate degree in 1993 as salutatorian of his class. He went on to earn his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University, where he was a Marshall Scholar. Graham is a historian of science and technology who has spent a great deal of time studying and writing about histories of the earth and the sea from the 17th century on. Graham has published numerous scholarly books and articles, and he has contributed essays and reviews to a variety of publications, including the New York Times, The Economist, the Times Literary Supplement, to name a few. Along the way, he has won very many academic prizes and distinguished fellowships. This luminous intellectual background, however, is not the only reason, or even the main reason, that we are excited to have Graham visit with us this evening. Graham caught the eye of the Coalition for Transformational Education because he has spent a great deal of time over the years thinking and studying and writing about attention. Specifically, he makes the case that our attention, and even more concerning, that of our children, grandchildren, and students, is being fracked and sold to the highest bidder. He doesn't stop there. Graham is a driving force in a growing movement of attention activism, which is dedicated to developing strategies to push back on this damaging incursion into our brains and equip every person, the words of the activists themselves, to freely give their attention to each other and the world. Over the next 35 to 40 minutes, I will ask Graham to lay out his view of why and how this assault on attention is happening, why it should be particularly concerning to those of us in education, and what we can do about it. We will do our best to save at least 20 to 25 minutes for questions and discussions with all of you. So without further ado, welcome Graham Burnett, and let's get down to it.
Thank you so much, Clayton, and it's really good to be here. And I'm going to ask that if my sound isn't good, Dana or someone who's in the chat will let me know, but take it away, Clayton.
Graham, you have said that we are the victims of human fracking, an arresting metaphor. Explain what you mean by this and how it relates to what is often and often benignly referred to as the attention economy.
Fabulous. Yeah, let's start with that image, that metaphor of not petroleum fracking, oil fracking, but human fracking, which does, I think, put a slightly finer and slightly scarier point on the challenges we confront in what is known in a more friendly sense as the attention economy. Before I kind of open that, though, I do want to just extend a special thank you to all of you who are out there in the room, bearing with Zoom, which isn't quite as much fun as having someone live at the front of the mic there, and to Keith and Richard and Dana and Clayton, you yourself, for making this possible. You know, Keith alluded in passing to some health stuff. Really just about nothing would have kept me from you this evening, except quite literally surgery this morning. And it is a testimony to how badly I wanted to be in good shape to have this conversation, that earlier this morning I had a conversation with two anesthesiologists and the surgeon in question saying, I don't want anything. Don't give me any anesthetic, just a little local here, because I will have to be compos mentis to talk about attention with the Coalition for Transformational Education. So I've got my little scar right here. And earlier today, I had 3 surgeon's hands in my neck. So it is a special joy to me that Keith and everybody made the pivot to let me join you this way and talk with a group I really care about. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I think the idea of coalitions and coalition building is so essential. And I've heard a little bit about how that's already emerged across your day today as a key theme. And those of us who think of ourselves as attention activists join you in that sense, that only by means of coordinated, distributed, collective action are we able to effect the kinds of positive change we need. So key for you all in the education space generally, key for us in the attention space. And what we're going to want to talk about today is the important and extensive overlap between the attention space, the challenges to the cultivation of a diverse range of attentional forms, and the education space. That's really our heartland. Maybe with a little chat about the implications of AI for all this, because I would be surprised if that isn't on a lot of your minds out there today. Yeah, so let's just start right in. I'll use some visual aids as we go, so I'll throw this up just real quick. That image of human fracking traces itself back now a few years to an op-ed that a group of us published in the Times. And what's at the heart of that metaphor is the perfect analogy between the way petroleum frackers are getting value out of the deep earth and the way that the attention economy is getting value out of you and everyone you love. So let's review for a second. Exactly what is petroleum fracking? Back in the old days, there was crude oil in big zits close to the surface. You could drill a hole in some places down there in Texas and elsewhere in the world and just get oil. It would just come up to the surface, a gusher. There isn't any of that left. Now, to access the widely distributed, lower value petroleum and natural gas that's widely distributed in the deep layers of the planet, it is necessary to pump down into the earth high volume, high pressure detergent, which forces to the surface a kind of toxic stew of dissolved hydrocarbons and a lot of other nasty stuff. That's what you pump down in the first place. You separate that stuff off and you get your oil and gas. That's fracking. And it's not especially terrific for the planet in certain ways. Tectonic activity engendered by the breaking up of the structure of the earth deeply. So little earthquakes and that kind of stuff. And then the toxins that are left on the surface as you try to disaggregate the monetizable oil from all the bad stuff. Now think about your devices. Human attention, eyeballs, are a commodity, but they are a widely distributed commodity. And in a sense, any individual pair of eyeballs isn't worth all that much, really, because if you're trying to sell high tops, you have to get those high tops in front of a lot of people before you can actually get cash value out of that. Our increasingly intensive industrial scale attention economy involves the pumping into our faces of high volume, high pressure detergent to crack the deep structures of personality and self-formation and to force to the surface, tragically often a kind of slightly toxic stew of separable, auctionable attention, continuously being, as we all understand, arbitraged in the open marketplace that we don't see to advertisers by the millisecond. And the result, we see and feel and understand the result. And I'm going to turn back to you, Clayton, to kind of pick up this thread. But I want to emphasize that as a historian, because as Clayton said, you know, my formal academic training is in the history and philosophy of science. And I've been working for about the last 10 or 15 years on the history of the scientific study of attention in laboratories. And I want to just remind you that this scale of heedless and irresponsible and largely unregulated exploitation of something so essential to human personhood, our ability to care about ourselves and the world and each other, the commodification of that capacity to care on this industrial scale and by means of these incredibly intimate cognitive prosthetics, this is very new. And it's not good for people. And it's essential that as educators and just as citizens and human beings, we become attuned and cognizant and begin to develop collective strategies to push back against this dynamic.
So Graham, just reading up on your work and listening to some of your talks, it became clear that you distinguished types of attention, and there's historical warrant for that. The kind of um, attention that has been being studied and refined and perfected in the lab and has now been co-opted for other purposes. And then something you call free attention. And I think it's important for the audience to understand that basic distinction before we turn to the question of why attention is so central to the project of education.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I'll again, if you all can see this stuff, throw something up real quick, just because, you know, I'm a teacher. So this is the syllabus for my current course on attention and modernity at Princeton. This is a lecture class. And this is where the rubber meets the road on that last 10 or 15 years of archival work. And I won't try to summarize my 23 lectures on this exactly, but I will give you the cliff notes to the way the course arcs. And so just as Clayton has said, the core message of this class and of a great deal of the work I do on a nonprofit and activist basis goes like this. When we now talk about our attention, when we worry about our attention spans, or we say, hey, everybody's like not able to pay attention, read books the way they used to, we are mostly talking about a very, very narrow and specific kind of psychological and sensory phenomenon, which you can call attention, because it's attentional, but it has a history. Attention is an enormously rich and capacious universe of different kinds of mental experiences, forms of life. And that ecosystem, that diversity of our human attentional capacities has been, if you like, across the 20th century, largely rendered a kind of monoculture. And the academic work I do is on how that happened. And there's a short answer that's not that complicated. The scientific study of human attention in laboratories in the developed world, largely in the United States in the 20th century, was work that focused on slicing and dicing, quantifying and instrumentalizing this very narrow range of sensory and cognitive capacities. Who was doing that research? I don't want you to think I'm some kind of crazy paranoiac, but let's be honest. The research was being funded by the military-industrial complex, who had all the money to fund research in the human sciences in the period after about 1940. What was wanted was exactly tracking and triggering, shooting down airplanes, and vigilance. How long can people pay attention to screens? Those two essential cybernetic human capacities, people's ability to stay with machines by tracking and triggering and responding to stimuli, and their ability to stay with durationally screens in the form of monitoring, not just radar screens, but in general, the sort of new forms of work that arose in the kind of new industrialization of large-scale factories and monitoring systems. It's kind of, some of you will have heard of time and motion studies back when they were studying how to personally in the 1950s and 1960s, there's a new form of labor. It's sort of time and non-motion studies, because there's a huge amount of labor that involves staring at the dials on a control panel of one sort. And diced in laboratories was in a sense pre-stressed to be priced in the marketplace. And that form of attention is not the form of attention we want to be fighting to get back. So it's not like a screen time app that's going to save you an additional, or save your child or save your student an extra 15 or 20 minutes of that kind of always already operationalized, instrumentalized stimulus tracking response vigilance. That's not going to enrich your life. It's not going to be consistent with human flourishing. It's not equal to the dignity of human freedom. And it is certainly inadequate to what those of us who think in terms of the liberal arts and the humanities in particular, what we need, want, hope to engender. So a lot of the work that we do as attention activists, and I'll say more about that in a moment, is to try to remind people of the diversity of activities that comprise our attentional lives, remind us of the specio's jungle of attentionality, and sort of raise the gaze up from this monoculture to the horizon of tracking and triggering kinds of attention.
So I'd like to follow your lead. You have quoted often Simone Weil, who wrote an essay in 1942 that you have cited, reflecting on the right use of school. And in that essay, she laid out her vision for the ultimate purpose of education. And it is not learning some subject or skill, but rather training attention itself, the actual mental activity that makes all learning possible. So when I came across that work with Simone Weil's thoughts and words in one of your talks, I'm like, well, that's exactly right at the heart of the Venn diagram we're talking about tonight. So what kind of attention was she taking for granted in 1942? Where is it now? What's happening in the heart of the education project?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I really want to keep this very actionable for those of you who are in the room, both the virtual room on Zoom and physically in the room there, hopefully getting some dessert by this point. So that image of the formation of attentional capacities as the ultimate end or aim of education, invoked so powerfully by Simone Weil, very beautiful. The history of people worrying about the kids' ability to pay attention in educational spaces, very long history. So, all the way back, as long as you like. And indeed, my friend and colleague Jamie Kreiner did a lovely book on monks and all their complaining about how much trouble they had paying attention, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, a little plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose kind of thing. And it is true that people have worried about their attentional capacities. It is possible, and I think this is a significant argument, that for much of the lives of many of the people in this room, it was possible to think that what you did as an educator is walk into a room with a set of students who had already achieved a certain kind of formation in terms of their essential attentional capacities or habits. And that then your job as an educator was to teach some subject. So you weren't teaching them to read exactly, you were teaching a course on Shakespeare's sonnets. I do think that at this remarkable watershed, wherein the brief span of 15 years, the miracles of modern science and engineering, which we laud and esteem and think are fabulous, have presented us with these new, incredibly powerful computers that are always with us and matrix them in this extraordinary data infrastructure that delivers so much so quickly to all of us. And that capitalism has chosen to finance all of that in its infinite wisdom by means of this extraordinary new sort of circa $3 or $4 trillion industry powered by advertising that is algorithmically driven and that is what we are calling human tracking. In that context, we all need to be thinking anew. It is not that you can count on getting a room full of students or a college campus full of people who have an attentional habitus that is ready for the educational forms of self-formation and citizen formation and confrontation with the questions of freedom and responsibility and community that are the sort of hallmarks of the modern college university system in our universe. You can't count on that. It's not that they don't have attentional capacities or that their attention has sort of been exactly damaged. I mean, actually, no, their attentional capacities have just been retrained in a kind of hypertrophied tracking and triggering, immersive, screen-based form of life. And as it turns out, that ecosystem, as in some sense already Neil Postman was pointing out, how many years ago now was amusing ourselves to death, that ecosystem is very difficult to mesh with a lot of what we care about as educators in the liberal arts, and for that matter in engineering and the sciences across the board. So it is possible to argue that in a new and radical way, education now must be an education to and for attention. But let me quickly then note that if we aren't careful when we say that, we're going to sound a little bit like a sort of unpleasant schoolmastery, late Victorian, wrapping a stick on the board, who also wanted everybody to sort of have disciplined attention. And the great danger is that by talking in terms of attentional formation without being careful about the extremely complex and diverse attentional forms that are in play, we will actually just play right into the dynamics of a kind of cybernetic interpolation and a kind of slipstreaming of our students and our children directly into an effectively extractive and operationalized form of existence, which will make them ill, sick, because it's inconsistent with our natures. It dehumanizes and brutalizes people. So that's a way of saying, when we say the formation of attention becomes the aim of education, we need to step back long enough to be like, what do we mean by attention? And be sure that we don't just mean, how long can you pay attention to this dot? And if I move it, can you stay with it? Because as it turns out, that form of attentionality is being taught just fine by our devices. And that's part of the reason we face students who are severed from each other profoundly in many cases with historically unprecedented rates of depression. And footnote for the people who care, there's an extensive social scientific and indeed epidemiological literature where folks debate exactly how tight the causal ties are between screen use and youth mental health. I'm going to just, as a pull rank as a historian of science and say, it took 48 years to have successful proof that cigarettes were causing lung cancer. I'm not going to wait for the resolution of the exquisite statistical disputations being played out by interested parties concerning the way that aspects of the financing of these devices are bad for humans. I'm not waiting for that. We got to get out ahead of it a little bit more.
So Graham, you have the benefit of being a teacher, a live teacher of live students at this moment. And you've been marinating in these questions and figuring out how they should be conceptualized. But you've also been working really hard to get your students on the right track, if you will. And I'm just curious, since we've got a room full of people who are, many of whom are doing the same thing, what sort of strategies you've used just at a very pragmatic level. And then I know we've got wider strategies to talk about beyond this, but I'm just curious about as a college professor.
Yeah, I mean, I want to do both at once, Clayton. I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to
Yeah.
work with my students, but then I want to also say from my heart that I think of my students as sort of, they're so special, but they're also kind of, in their own way, a little anomalous, because they're they're a mix of some astounding outliers, and a lot of extremely closely curated young people who've been cared for and whose capacities have been cultivated and fussed over. And I don't mean to be reductionist, but I get students who are quite churned up to kind of do the reading at the undergraduate level. But many of my closest friends who teach in other kinds of institutions confront different sorts of challenges. So we want to stay alive to the diversity of the challenges in this space. I would say that what moves me most are forms of teaching that increasingly make use of direct activations, exercises, protocols, scores. This would take us down a proper theoretical kind of line. I actually think the most important artistic and aesthetic and also analytic form for our moment is the collective score, exercise, or protocol. And I have some separate work I can, I push to people if they're curious about this. I'm talking about things like the action poems of Fluxus, but also the kinds of neo-liturgical forms of something like the Ignatian spiritual exercises. You have to actually do synchronized attentional work in groups to give people the kind of experiences that nourish their love for what their attention can achieve. And we are doing this, lest that sound visionary and mad. I'm going to screen share here for a moment. And I know we want to get to the room for some Q&A, but I can't resist, in a sense, doing a plug for my coalition as it meets your coalition. This is the website for the international coalition known as the Friends of Attention. And the Friends of Attention are maybe 300 or 400 artists, activists, writers, and others who came out of 2018 and the Sao Paulo Biennial, an art event, where a bunch of artists and creatives who were thinking about attention, because that was the theme of the biennial, were present. And where, because of the political complexity of Brazil in 2018, the group said, oh my heavens, there's a clear sense that democratic expression is being suborned in complex ways because of the kind of Cambridge Analytica dynamics of algorithmic structured social media and the kind of new forms of data intensive, you could call it, public relations if you wanted to reach back to the early 20th century, but it's turbocharged in the era of social media. And so this group emerged, nonprofit group, which has written together, done a book called The 12 Theses on Attention, which is sort of our manifesto, done a film together, working on another book together that'll be out shortly. And even kind of more powerfully, over the last 2.5 years, this nonprofit coalition has actually created a school. And this is a non-credit, in real life, physical school with a fair bit of online programming based in Brooklyn, named after a former student of mine, a beautiful human, Matthew Strother, who passed away from cancer at the tender age of 36 a couple of years ago, and who was active in the coalition. Run by another former student of mine, Peter Schmidt, a brilliant young attention activist. And this is like the lead edge of the movement. We are built around the idea that what is urgent now is to gather people around three central projects: education around attention, consciousness raising around the centrality of shared attentional experiences as constitutive of the shared world, sort of for the Arendtians out there who want to talk about kind of world making. Attention is constitutive of that project. Organizing, coalition building. So we have a network of activists all around the country and beyond who identify their activities as forms of attention activism. Even if, what they're doing is rock climbing or knitting, they are like, hey, I'm doing this activity because it's a way of my coming together with an activity in the world and with other people that protects me from frackability. And then this notion of sanctuary, which has been really important to us, and I'll throw into the chat thread for people who are curious, this recent peer-reviewed article that we just did, co-authored with some folks in the coalition on rethinking our classrooms as attentional sanctuaries, rethinking our libraries and museums as attentional sanctuaries, drawing on meaningful aspects of the traditions that inform higher education, renewing that notion that there must be forms. And I don't want to sound ivory tower or Elysium, fields of Elysium here, but it is just absolutely necessary when you've got trillions of dollars of venture capital and the most powerful computational technologies available, and most of the most brilliant people leaving university, all working to get everybody to look over here and hold their attention for an additional tenth of a second or millisecond. When that's what's going on, those of us who hope to protect some non-inhuman form of being, that must be our work as educators, we have our work cut out for us. And it's going to require our explicitly saying, hey, we're going to do a little pushback work here on some of that. So folks who are local to New York, would love to see you at the Strother School. And if you're not, like your coalition and our coalition, there are some alignments of value, I believe.
So I think we should open up the time to the audience now. And I want to just underscore a point you made earlier, Graham, that you have spent a lot of time recently thinking about AI and what that has to do, what kind of fracking may be involved there, but I think more basically, what does that do to the educational project? But what I'd like to do is open it to the audience, and there's so many strands that the audience may be interested in pursuing, but I just want you to know that Graham has a lot to say about AI if anybody wants to go down that road. So with that, we really want to hear from you guys. And I think Keith and Dana, you'll help get the questions. And
we should set with our first question. So
right.
Hi, Graham. Thank you so much for being here virtually. I am interested in attention as it relates to attention deficit disorder, and it looks like there might be a chapter in your book here that I'm excited to take a look at. But in particular, I'm interested in it as it relates to anxiety and other mental health challenges that are particularly salient for our students at this time. And despite the narrative that such increased focus on attention is pathological, what we also know about ADHD and ADD is that there are some positive benefits around things like creativity and innovation. So I am wondering what your thoughts might be for how we might hold space for both the positive benefits of such increased attention abilities, if you will, alongside the difficulties surrounding that over-attention, and how we might hold space for both of those in our classrooms.
Thank you so much for that question, and crucial one. And when we do our labs and workshops at the Strother School, this is almost always one of the first questions we get, because our programs, we have classes that take up all different sort of subjects and engage them attentionally. And then we have our labs, which are these beautiful free workshop occasions to open people up to the diversity of attentional forms and just get the conversation going. And I assure you that at every one of our labs, people start by saying, hey, this is my experience attentionally, and I have a diagnosis, and I'm taking meds. So we've done a lot of thinking about the right way to engage that set of questions, acknowledging that we are not medical professionals, we are not mental health experts, we're not therapists. So I'm going to answer your question in a couple of different ways. I'm going to answer it sort of pragmatically with the kind of script in a way that we use in the labs when people surface those questions in the room. And then I'm going to talk a little bit as a historian of science. So let me do the pragmatics first. We have worked hard with a set of therapists, psychiatrists, and ADHD experts to make sure that the ways we talk about that aspect of attention in our labs feels right. And the language we've settled on is to say, hey, look, folks who have sort of non-typical manifestations of attention, you are crucial to us in helping us articulate clearly that there's something wrong right now with the narrowing of our conceptions of attention, and with precisely this kind of hyper-focalized tracking and triggering attentionality that is literally how we test. It's a significant component of how we test for ADHD is effectively a Comer test. It's a little bit like a kind of digital whack-a-mole. And it's kind of like only from the perspective of a history of 20th century experimental psychology in laboratories could you ever explain how it is that we have ended up assessing the well-being of children on the basis of this extremely narrow set of hyperfocalization tests, and that we end up with folks who are like, this is not where my being resides, and in a sense won't play that game the way we norm them. That's in a sense, what could we have expected? What could be more true? I mean, imagine trying to explain to a sort of Yanomami shaman that the way we assess the attentional capacities of our children is by setting them in front of a machine and seeing how long they can keep responding to electronic stimuli that pop in front of them. It's quite likely that that person, now with Starlink, the Yanomami shaman is probably playing Candy Crush, but bracket that. Before that, probably would have said, that's weird. We wouldn't necessarily assess our children on that very narrow stimulus and response form of cybernetic focalization, because that doesn't come up here that much. So we'll sometimes even say, hey, if you have a diagnosis, you think of yourself as an ADHD person, you may choose to think of yourself as kind of one of the canaries in the coal mine of the situation we're in right now. because your non-normative attentionality is a way of saying that what's non-normative here is not just you, that what's non-normative is what we're up to by so profoundly closing down on the richness of the way human can relate cognitively and sensorily to the world, to themselves, and to others. So that's a first cut at an answer to how we speak to this in our activism work. Broad church, come on in, help us out as we work to push back. Now I'm going to say something a little bit more controversial, which I want to say very carefully. I believe in ADHD. I acknowledge and recognize and defer to biomedical expertise. I recognize that there are objective biochemical and neurological indices that are a component of the diagnostic process. I hope everybody got that. And if you're recording that, I want that to have been heard. I also want to say, though, that I'm a historian of science, technology, and medicine. And I'm here to say that all ways of making sense of health and disease are historical. And I sometimes wonder if in 100 years, people will look back at our moment and they'll say, it is extraordinary that an era that was creating such profoundly mechanomorphic and dehumanizing attentional ecosystems got so, in a sense, comfortable with thinking of that, the manifestation of that in terms of individual somatic characteristics, rather than sort of also spatializing to sort of notice the system and the game. So I want to say this very carefully, because I'm not saying ADHD is not real. It's real, just like a collapsed lung is real. But I was in that grad seminar back in the 80s when we discussed the social construction of a collapsed lung, because a collapsed lung too is social. And ADHD is social. It's about the larger world that we are creating now. And one of the things that can really worry me is a kind of a little analogy I'll give you to the history of gambling and gambling addiction, which is really interesting. Some of you may know the extraordinary book by my colleague Natasha Dow-Schull, Addiction by Design, a book everyone should read, anthropologist who way back before the attention economy got hot, did an extraordinary book on video poker machines in Las Vegas. Who made them? Who set them up? Who programmed them? And then the larger social worlds into which they went. And so much of what we now see in the way these devices are programmed through dark patterns and deceptive design strategies to be addictive, so much of that was already set up with a very primitive technology like a video poker machine, which isn't really that much more complex than an analog alarm clock. But you can still, if you program them just right, leave a lot of humans sitting endlessly until they wet themselves and do themselves serious harm, going to zero playing those video poker machines. And I'll remind everybody that gambling addiction, which is also a disease and which is diagnosable and treatable, one of the major funders of treatment programs for addiction to gambling were, of course, the casinos. Because it was very important that individuals be understood to have a specific, it's a problem with you kind of problem. So they loved clinics that would take problematic gamblers and explain to them that they had a gambling addiction and that they could be treated, even as they were continuously developing and investing vast sums in sophisticated technologies to engender precisely addictive behavior, because that was their business model. It wasn't like an accident. It was like a plan. So Not a perfect analogy. However, because we believe as attention activists that the only hope lies in collective action, just like I hope you believe that the only hope for the future of education lies in collective action, in coalition building. This is the key message. And because these new technologies enable and disable collective action in new ways, we really have to work extra hard on this part of the story, right? Because these technologies that supposedly connect us all, they sever us too, and that's part of the story. So, as we think about collective action, we need to be especially wary of anyone who brings us an account of the problem or the solution that is a classic hyper-individualized neoliberal analysis. This is about you. You have a problem, and the good news is we can treat your problem, sort of, or you can work harder, do a 12-step program. Those things help. Yes, we are in favor of mindfulness and all forms of digital detox, and we also want everyone to have their ADHD treated. However, we also want to keep everybody remembering that when you tell a person you have a problem, you're slightly separating them from others. And what we have a problem, we have to keep remembering that's going to be where the real solution ultimately lies. Thank you for that. I went on a bit, but I really care about that, and I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Thanks, Graham. We're looking for another question. Yep. Traveling over.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to check out your book. My question is about the affordances of a residential college to act as a sanctuary for attention.
Oh, I love this. I literally, I don't know who you are, but stay close. Let's talk. I assure you, here I'm prognosticating rather than being a historian, but that's okay. Part of the reason you study the past is to understand the present, and the reason you go to the past is because we don't have access to the future. What we're dealing with right now is going to change. It's going to change over the next 20 years, meaning people have been pushed about as far as you can push them on this stuff, and they are starting to push back. We see it in regulations, we see it in legislation, we see it in litigation. Why am I saying that? Because all you out there, you can be trailblazers on this attention revolution. And if you don't want to be a nonprofit trailblazer in the education sector, you can go and create a for-profit business, if you like, that will profit on the next 25 years of revolutionary change as people push back against these forms of dehumanizing commodification of their attention. But it's not going to stay like this. We're just at the beginning of a big set of changes. And I could give you, analogies to large-scale social change that I think ring true, but let's bracket that. So to answer your question, I think that a residential college would be a fabulous space to pilot the kind of attention sanctuary program that we are pushing in this article, which is about not imposing the principles of some kind of sanctuary space, but rather about community guidelines. So what we advocate here, and I don't know how well you can actually see it up on the screen in front of you, but we worked for 2 years with a set of different working groups to develop a kind of template for the way different scales of grouping can perform a kind of constitutional convention together and decide how they're going to gather and what principles around the sharing and giving of attention they're going to honor in what synchrony or choreography in time and space. So this is so enriching. This is not about showing up in a school and trying to get all the kids to put their phones into little slots. I'm okay with that too, and schools need to address this kind of stuff any way they can. And classrooms are distinctive spaces where certain kinds of enforced top-down rules are absolutely necessary. But in something like a residential college, you've got a bunch of young adults, and they get this. Every one of my Princeton classes, I begin by saying, why are we gathering? Why are we here? We could do this online. Princeton could pay for my lectures to be recorded, and you could watch them at double time when you're in the shower. If we're going to be in a room together, this extraordinary privilege, which is endangered in higher education now, as we know, because it's not economically rational, and it isn't even especially equitable or expansively democratic. So if we're going to be in a room together, you, me, and these other 25 people, how are we going to honor this 50 minutes 3 times a week and make it worth our while and make it worth all the opportunity costs that are implied by our being in this room together? And the way we do that is we say, here's what we're not going to do. Here's what we are going to do. Here's the ways that we're going to make our being in the same room tell or count. And so I think that an amazing process of sanctuary guidelines work could be activated by academic leaders at an institution like an honors college or a residential college. And I have some stories I could share. Out at UC Santa Cruz, the dean of the honors college out there bought 600 copies of the 12 Theses of Attention, distributed them to all the students, brought us out to do a set of attention workshops to kind of get that process rolling. I just did a presidential lecture up at Iona College, about 30 minutes north of here in Manhattan. Fascinating institution that's working really hard, and they are themselves embarking on a kind of attention-themed component of their campus, drawing on their own, and this is something all you folks out there will immediately think of. Iona is a Catholic institution historically founded by the Irish Christian Brothers. Its name harkens back to the earliest monastery in the British Isles, founded by St. Columba in whatever, the 6th century. So they got very excited about saying, hey, wait a second, our kind of actual institutional traditions reach back to an idea of a certain sanctuarial space for a certain kind of contemplative commitment to teaching and learning and study. And so we're going to kind of bend this attention sanctuary theme to our kind of local conditions in a way. So I hope that gets going, but I didn't hear your name, but just write an email, dburnett@princeton.edu, will connect you up, because we are looking for pioneering institutions to hit some of this stuff. And we've just begun to get some of those kinds of grants that let us support and help with this stuff, and we're interested in co-writing. We're starting a project with the New York Public Library here. The Emerson Collective linked us to the NYPL, which has 65 branch libraries in the 5 boroughs with after-school programs. They need to pivot. They've thought about information access as their primary, their primary calling in life was to give people access to the internet. And now they need to kind of be like, actually, everybody's got access to the internet. They don't need that. They need a different way of thinking about what they could do to protect themselves, in a sense, from the costs of those kinds of interpolations. Thank you for that. And Dana, have you got somebody else there? Yeah, great.
I think I'm on. Yeah, this is Keith. We're rapidly getting to the end of our time together, unfortunately. But I know, Clayton, you wanted to at least give Graham a bit of a chance to give a hint about some of his ideas related to AI and his latest thinking. And I wonder if you could talk just briefly about that to kind of give us something to think about more as we go off and end today and then come back tomorrow morning. Thanks.
Clayton, you've got your mic turned off again, so pop it on.
Sorry, this is all you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Keith, for that. And thank you, Clayton. And thank you all in the room. I know you've had a long day, so that you're still in the chairs. That means a lot to me. I really appreciate it. So it's true that I have been thinking so much about AI, as I'm sure many of you have. And maybe the fastest way for me to talk about this is just to say I have exciting news, which is that the essay I just wrote last weekend, I was so churning on this stuff that I just dropped everything and wrote all day Saturday, all day Sunday, the weekend before last. And that piece is going to come out in the New Yorker in another week or two about AI and the humanities. So I can give you a précis of some of what I claim there, but basically, tune in, it'll be out soon, you can check it out. I'm bullish, excited in a lot of ways about what this moment means. I've been using AI very intensely in my own work and experimenting with using it pretty intensely in my classes. This is a very complicated topic. Very different kinds of humans, different kinds of challenges at different levels of education. But for those of us who are working in the humanities in higher education, I think we have to celebrate, be open-spirited, and move toward this moment. And on the one hand, it's worth remembering that this is actually like an opportunity to talk directly to the algorithms that are so powerfully fracking us, and that's kind of interesting. And we know that the killer app of AI is going to be right back in the attention economy. That is, these systems are capable of holding us in ChatGPT intimacy conversations, giving rise to it, not the attention economy, but the intimacy economy. And if you think that ChatGPT, I don't know how many of you have been playing around on this stuff a lot, isn't soon going to be asking you if you'd like to go to Chipotle and get some fries when you're in the middle of a really soulful conversation with it, you're crazy, because we know where this is going. Why should we not be terrified and feel like this is the end times? Real quick, I think we have spent too little time in the humanistic side of higher education, cleaving close to the questions of how to live and what to do. We've allowed ourselves to become sort of knowledge producers, like scientists, about the artifacts of human culture. And that is good work, and that's how you tenure your faculty, and that's how I got tenure doing that kind of work. The truth is that work is on the cusp of being almost entirely outsourceable. I mean, I look at all those beautiful books behind Clayton, and I got myself about 1,000 of them in my office, and increasingly I already see them as strangely archaic. And the 800-page book I wrote on the historical study of whales and dolphins, I hope they don't have it there, because it's the most boring book ever written, but it is a history of science book about the study of whales and dolphins. It's almost a question of prompt engineering now to write that book a couple of different ways by clicking buttons. That could be bad, but what does Marshall Berman say? We have to pivot from apocalypse to dialectic. And the dialectic here is to embrace what this means as we return to the questions of being. Because those aren't going to go away. The machines cannot answer those questions for us. The machines can't even have questions. They can only answer them. Living with the questions, that's our work, and that's what our students need us as teachers to be willing to do with them and show them what that is. So this isn't going to help with basic reading and stuff like that. That's somebody else's problem to try to solve. I can't do that. What I can say is I'm giving my students assignments they want to do, because I can't police them anymore, right? Can't. I'm not going to try to keep track of whether they're writing their papers using ChatGPT. Impossible, basically. So what does that mean? Just like I say we're going to gather, and we're going to make something happen because we're here, I say to them, we're going to do work that matters to us. And I am excited about what that means. It means, and this is the last thought I'll leave you with, that we can begin to shift from thinking continuously in terms of knowledge production, which the machines are going to do pretty darn well, to study, because study is what makes us. Study is the work of being with the stuff that's worth being with others, and that's how we step into our historical consciousness, our meaningful inhabitation of our freedom, and our meaningful inhabitation of this planet and our relations with other people. Study. And that's not going to go away. But we have not been emphasizing that, except in a sort of like there's an exam on Wednesday and you better study for it sense. That sense of study, we need to begin to let go. But the form of study that makes human persons, that's our kind, right? And I'll leave you with those beautiful words of Guattari Spivak. You know, what's education? It's the non-coercive rearranging of desire. It's the non-coercive rearranging of desire. And that's the work that we do. And the machines are not going to do that for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate that great last thought, and we greatly appreciate you spending your evening with us, particularly after a very long day for us and for you. So we appreciate that time, and we hope you well. We wish you health and all goodness, and we'll continue the program tomorrow. And for the people here in the room, there is the bus that will be waiting for you to take you back to the hotel. Thank you again, Graham. Thank you again, Clayton.
Thank you.